from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
On today's program, and again next week, we're going to be discussing with you safety and air flights. And as you well know, there have been a number of tragedies in recent months. The most well-publicized was the John F. Kennedy Jr. Tragedy on the East Coast. And then more recently, the tragedy of Payne Stewart and his associates in a crash, and also a major commercial airline from Egypt. On our program, we wish to discuss some of these issues and what the rules are, and we're very, very fortunate to have with us today an expert that can do that for us and to assist you in understanding more about safety in flight. I welcome to the program John R. Black. He is the Safety Program Manager at the Flight Standards District Office in Spokane for the Federal Aviation Administration. Mr. Black, welcome to our program, and I appreciate the fact of the time that you've given me in preparing for this program, and you're most articulate, and I know our viewers will be very, very informed with you as our guest. And thank you for appearing both this week and next week.
Well, thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight.
And I also want to welcome our regular panel. First of all, is Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Mr. Black, you're associated with the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration. Can you tell us what all the different divisions are? What does the FAA govern?
Sure. Most people, when they think of the FAA, they think of air traffic. They think of the controllers that guide the airplanes or direct them through the sky. And that does make up probably the major portion of the FAA. There's about 16,000 employees in the flights in the air traffic service. The one that I am affiliated with is called Flight Standards, and we deal with rules and regulations and the certification of pilots and the standards associated with both pilots and the aircraft. Another section is aircraft certification. All airplanes, or I'll back up, all civil aircraft in the United States have a what they call an airworthiness certificate. So that means that they are certificated by the FAA. Now, an exception to this are the home builds, and that's a whole different story there. Another section of the FAA is the security division. These are the federal air marshals. When you go through the security at the airport, the FAA's security is pretty much what handles all of that. And they're also looking for terrorist threats and anything else that might be of a hazard to the aviation community.
And getting right into that area, then what is the difference between IFR and VFR, for example? What do those things stand for, and what are they?
Okay, IFR is Instrument Flight Rules. And what that means, in very simple terms, is the pilot relies totally on what's in front of him in his or her instrument panel. You read the instruments. There is nothing on the outside world. It's not like driving a car where you can look down the road. Your whole world is just right there within the instrument panels. Your attitude, remember that airplanes go in a three-dimensional array. And so consequently, you have the instruments that show your position. And it's very regulated. It has to be, because you cannot see one another when you are in the clouds. Now, VFR is a totally different thing. It's visual. It's kind of like driving your car. It's more or less the Sunday afternoon pilot who goes out for a ride, and you can look down. You can see somebody's house. You can go through, and you are flying by reference to the outside versus flying strictly by the instruments.
Steve Sheen.
I'm going to follow up, Mr. Black, if I may, a little bit on Janelle's line of questioning, but I want to back up a bit first. We're going to talk mostly about small aircraft in this show, and then move on to other issues next week. How many small aircraft pilots are licensed in the United States, roughly?
I don't have that right on the top of my head. I know there's more than 10 million, I believe.
Well, and that figure is huge, but it doesn't totally surprise me because I am amazed at how many people I bump into in day-to-day life and in work who are pilots. How rigorous is the licensing of those pilots? And let's start with visual instrument rating.
Okay, now just to become visual flight rules,
yes, sir.
which would be your typical private pilot. People think anybody who's not flying on the airlines is a private pilot. Okay, a private pilot it used to be the lowest standard of certification. Now we have what they call the recreational pilot too, but I only know of three in the state of Idaho. It's really never caught on. The private pilot basically takes 40 hours of training. That is the bare minimum. Most of them have, I believe the average is around 65. And they go up and they learn airspace procedures, they learn emergency procedures, they learn how to fly at night. They have 3 hours of night flying. They learn how to go from point A to point B without getting lost, how to land the airplane in wind, and they have a little bit of instrument training, about 3 hours, but that's about it, only about 3 hours of instrument training. And that allows them to fly either day, night, what we call the VFR. Mm-hmm. Now, they can go on and get advanced ratings. They can get an instrument rating, which allows them to fly under IFR, which means in the clouds. And it used to be that it took about 200 hours. Now, you can start your instrument training as soon as you receive your pilot certificate. So you can start working towards additional ratings.
Now, Mr. Black, when you say 40 hours, approximately 40 to 65,
yes,
somewhere
mm-hmm.
there, is that air time or is that total training time, classroom and flying time?
That is just air time. There
okay.
is no specific requirement for ground time, but you have to pass a written test, and most people have probably at least 20 or 30 hours of ground in instruction along with their flight time.
Now, the instrument flight rating that you talked about after that, is that full instrument rating, or are there some intermediate steps between private pilot license and an instrument rated pilot?
It is a full instrument rating. Once you get your private, you can go forward and get your instrument rating. But once again, it's kind of like a person who learns to drive a car. Do they go out on a New York freeway on a busy day? Mm-hmm. You have to use a little judgment.
Sure. And one more question, if Tony will
sure.
allow me, and this is another one that you may not have an immediate answer to, but a rough guess is fine. About what percentage of those, I'll call them non-commercial pilots, they're not making their living at this, but they're licensed to fly. What percentage are instrument rated versus visual rated?
I'm not sure, but I would just estimate probably no more than 20%.
So by far, most, I don't want to use that recreational term but most pilots who don't fly for a living are visual rated only.
That is correct.
Thank you very much.
No, that's very, very helpful. Mr. Black, so many of our viewers that will be watching would be wanting to know about some statistics about the issue that I introduced of safety and when accidents most likely to happen or under what conditions, if they have I guess what we talk about type of flight plans or what. I'm going to ask our staff this time to put up on the screen a graph for us, and that really is illustrative. If you'll explain this to us, what this means.
Okay, what this graph is, it has the type of flight plans when accidents are involved, and you can look at that and see that by far, and I believe it's about 65% of all the accidents, there is no flight plan filed.
That sends a very strong message, doesn't it?
A very strong message. VFR, even just filing a VFR flight plan, it goes down to about 15%. And then for IFR down below 10, and unknown, usually we do know on an accident investigation if there was a flight plan filed, mm-hmm. because there's always a record made.
So I read this chart, and I could be wrong, but I read it to say that the more responsible you are and the more that you are cautious and in preparing for flight and even reporting so forth, the greater chances are of having safety.
That is very correct. What a flight plan does is it shows you have more accurately planned your flight out. You have thought about it. It's not a spur of the moment occurrence.
We have a second one now, the chart that just went up on the phase of the flights when there's most likely to be a problem. Is that correct?
Yes, what this is for spatial disorientation. This is a pilot who, for one reason or the other, either flying into the clouds or getting into total darkness, loses sight of the horizon.
And so the accidents there on that chart says it's in the descent.
It's in the descent, and there's some reasons for that. If a pilot is flying around straight and level, they're basically 1 g of gravity. They're sitting there, they're going like this, it's 1 g. When they push the nose of the airplane over, they get a little bit of a negative g. And physiologically, that changes some of our senses. And it starts playing some tricks on us.
And so you're almost like you're in a tunnel or something when it's dark at night, and like in John Kennedy's case, over the ocean and so forth. So would I be correct to, in the form of a question, to suggest to you that for those who are instrument trained and they don't rely upon the human errors that are so common, that you're more likely to bring a plane down safely, and that I, as a passenger, would be better off flying with someone who is instrument trained?
Anytime that there are not good visual conditions, absolutely. You do not want to be flying with anyone who is not instrument qualified and current.
And let me have one more question before I return to the panel. For those who aren't instrument trained for flying in these difficult conditions, obviously they shouldn't be in those conditions, I would assume, when if they can avoid them, unless it happens during the flight. But my question would be that if we have two pilots, and one of them has approximately 150 hours or 200, and another one has maybe 1,000 hours, and let's assume neither one of them are instrument trained, but does it increase the chance that a more experienced pilot could cope with those difficult conditions?
Possibly, but I would not count on it. Once again, and the standards the FAA sets for this are very specific. You have to have the qualifications and the currency. Because even myself, and I have thousands of hours of flying under instruments. It's been a while since I have done it. I would go get some recurrent training before I would go up myself, because I know what can happen.
And I just want our viewers to know that you're a pilot, and you've flown for many, many hundreds of hours, and you've also investigated accidents, so you have that expertise to be so helpful to us. Janelle Berg.
This is such a broad area, but I have a series of little questions. The first one is, do you have to file a flight plan if you're flying at night?
No, you do not in the lower United States. You do in Canada, but not in the U.S.
So you really don't have to file a flight plan if you're flying at night or in the daytime. You can fly visual as long as the conditions allow that.
That is correct.
And not be in violation of the rules.
That is correct.
Now, with regard to night flying as well, do you have to be IFR rated in order to fly at night?
No, you do not. But as part of the private pilot training, you have to receive 3 hours of night flight and a night cross-country flight, plus 10 takeoffs and landings at night. Otherwise, you have a restriction from a night flying, which would disallow you from doing any night flying.
And I'm taking it that, generally speaking, night flying, your vision is different, just as it is in a car. At night, you see things differently.
It's totally different, especially in an airplane, because, and there are a lot of illusions out there at night. Bright lights look closer. Dim lights look like they're further away. You don't have the horizon nearly as much at night. So most pilots have to use extra caution at night versus flying on a nice sunny day.
Retractable gear, what does that mean?
That simply means when you take off, the gear folds up into the fuselage of the airplane, and it reduces the amount of drag.
And another thing that people might go on from their first pilot's license, their initial private license, and then they get their IFR, and then they might want to get multi-engine. Mm-hmm. And what kind of thing would that be?
Multi-engine training, there is no set number of hours. It is a proficiency standard. And you go up and you learn how to fly an airplane, but most of the training is based around learning to fly if one of the engines fails, and the procedures that you have to accomplish to be able to safely do that.
Steve Sheen.
Well, Mr. Black, I've got so many questions. I'm not going to get them all in, but I'll take a run at it. I'm going to guess that there's some kind of a curve you could plot in terms of pilot experience and accident rate. Tony got close to this with his question, but I want to follow up on it a little bit. I'd also guess that it's higher for pilots with very little experience. Is that correct?
Well, strangely enough, student instruction and the real low-time students or the real low-time pilots have a fairly good record. It's when they go along a little further and get a little confidence, I guess you could call it a little cockiness.
A bold pilot syndrome?
Yes, the bold pilot who never becomes an old pilot. And it does show that I believe from 150 up to 500 hours, you'll see quite an increase in the accident rate.
I see. Well, let me follow up on that a little bit also. How big a percentage of small craft accidents are due to pilot error?
Well, they call them pilot error, or there was pilot involvement. Even if you have a mechanical function or malfunction on an airplane, that doesn't mean that you are going to crash. If you use the right procedures, you can get it down. But probably, and I think the last time I looked at in 1998, it was 83%.
And this is something I heard from a friend of mine who was a very careful private pilot, instrument rated but wouldn't fly instruments, et cetera, because he didn't get enough experience, not enough hours. He said that a surprisingly high number of small craft accidents involve alcohol use on the part of the pilot. Do you see that a lot?
I have not seen a lot of it. The FAA now on commercial aviation has very stringent standards for that. We are all subject, anyone who flies commercially is subject to random drug and alcohol testing. If you're caught flying with under the influence, we'd probably suspend your certificate for a minimum of 6 months. The second time, you'd probably have a revocation. The FAA takes that very seriously. I have not personally seen much of it. I do know that there are some cases of it, but this is my opinion. I don't think it is as widespread as in driving a car.
I see. And a sort of a follow-up again to one of Janelle's questions, but related to my own experience and friends who fly. I was very surprised to hear a local pilot and an experienced pilot tell me that he thought that one of the contributing factors to John Kennedy's accident was that he was flying in too much plane. That if he'd been in a lower tech airplane that he was more familiar with, he might have had a better chance of recovering from mistakes that he is presumed to have made.
Well, that's kind of speculation, but I can understand your friend's line of reasoning on that. The more complex the airplane, the more fast it is, the faster things happen. The more things that you have to keep track of. And in accidents, very rarely is it any one factor that causes an accident. It is a chain of factors. And if you can take out one of those factors, you can usually stop the accident. In this case, he was a low-time pilot. He was flying a fairly complex airplane. I believe it was a Saratoga, which is about 300 horsepower. It's retractable gear. Pretty hot little number for
new to him.
Yes, and new to him. I don't know how many hours I have the preliminary report on that, but I don't remember exactly how many hours, but I know it was like less than 20 hours in that airplane. And just to know how to work all the navigation radios, to be familiar with the different power settings, the air speeds, and just the feel of the airplane.
And to continue with your line of reasoning, I understand that he had a much earlier flight plan intended, that he intended to leave earlier and would have been strictly under visual conditions and was delayed.
Yes, it's my understanding that he had originally planned to go totally during the daylight hours. and his sister-in-law, I believe, was late getting off work or for some reason. And that kind of set the stage because darkness was starting to set in. The visibility was legal, but it was marginal. And over open water, there was nothing underneath to show a horizon. And so he was probably getting a little fatigued, and he was probably a little nervous because he knew that was
pushing his limits.
Yeah, and he was going to make an extra landing, which also made him a little nervous. One of the things in spatial orientation that does happen are fatigue and nervousness. Makes it happen much faster.
Thank you.
Some more statistics that you've been so great to give us so much information prior to the program. I noticed from some of the information that I have that the construction of planes and what we've been talking about, the sophistication of planes that, for lack of better terminology with my illiteracy in this field, is that I call them homemade planes, that some people have their own kit. And I noticed from your data that those appear to be very risky. Would you just kind of give us a kind of a scale of homemade planes, and then some of the private planes by some of the major companies, and then the large commercial planes, the military planes? What do those things tell us about safety?
Well, starting with the home-built aircraft, you have to remember these are amateur-built. They are not certificated by the FAA. The FAA does issue an airworthiness certificate in the experimental category for them. And an FAA inspector or a designee goes out and inspects the builder's work after it's and make sure that it meets basic airworthiness standards. But there's been no engineering in a lot of cases that have that has gone into these airplanes. And they're usually flown by low-time pilots who it's just a hobby. And some of them are, in some respects, more state-of-the-art than the certificated planes. Well, but this brings another problem. They're fast, and sometimes they're not quite as stable. So this is one of the problems. A certificated airplane has a better standard of safety. It's simply because the manufacturers have to go through FAA certification, and they have to meet the standards now prior to putting that aircraft on the market.
And so they have a higher safety record than the home-built plane.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah, when you look at accidents and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sound all gloomy and don't want to discourage people from flying. You know, what a wonderful way to get somewhere when you have to. I had to go last week to San Diego. I taught on Wednesday, went down and spoke on Thursday, and back in class on Friday. I couldn't have driven and done that. And I also want to tell our viewers that we are doing this program in the first week of November. By the time it airs, you know, other things could have happened about some of the information. But I do have before me an appendix from you that talks about all airplanes and accidents that took place between 1975 and 1996. And the good news is that it's more safe now than it used to be, because according to this, if I'm reading the table correctly, in 1975 there were 3,644 accidents, and in 1996 there were only 1,681. Would you comment on, are we getting more expertise and safety conscious with our flying?
Yes, we definitely are. And you mentioned the commercial aviation there. In commercial aviation, it is getting very close to 100%. The accident rate on commercial aviation is infinitesimally small. They say your chances of being struck by lightning are greater than being killed in an airplane crash. The problem is there's getting to be a lot more flights. So even if we keep the safety rate the same, if you add more flights to it, there will be more accidents. So the FAA, through a new project called Project Safer or the Safer Skies Initiative, are trying to squeeze every last bit of safety out of aviation that we possibly can. There's a lot of initiatives going on now. If you remember a couple of years ago, Federico Pena said he wanted to get it up to a 0. Well, most people know that it's going to approach 0, but as far as human beings, it's pretty difficult to ever get there. But we're going to do everything that's humanly possible to get it near that level. And we need to. The public is demanding it.
Another question I have has to do with, again, types of planes and so forth. We've been talking briefly about single-engine planes and multi-engine and so forth. How do those different types of planes fit into the safety record?
Well, aviation in and of itself is safe, but it's not without risk. So it depends on how much risk you want to accept. If you're going to take a small single-engine plane and fly from here to Denver over the Rocky Mountains, you are going to subject yourself to a lot more risk than if you ride in a 747 from here to Denver. The small airplanes, you can take off and land on small airports. You can take off of actually just grass strips, whereas the larger aircraft can only land on what we call a certificated airport under Part 139. Like Spokane International is a Part 139 place. Phelps Field is not. Coeur d'Alene has partial certification. They can bring air charters in there with large jets.
So we are saying that, over a long flight with a small plane, weather changes from place to place in different times of the year, so that would be a factor. But also on the positive side would be that if you had trouble, you're more likely to be able to bring a plane down many different places if it's a small plane rather than a large one. So there are some issues here about
I'm not sure that's really an issue. Remember, the large airplane goes up and goes pretty much over the top of the weather. They don't fly through very much of it. When there's thunderstorm season, they have to go around them because some of the thunderstorms will go up to 40-some thousand feet, and they do go around those. But for the most part, the large aircraft just go up and above it. It's not even a factor.
They're equipped and they know where it is.
They know where it is. They're flying on instruments.
Pilots will tell the time we're going to go around this storm, which is always a very great relief. On that note, I bring our program to a conclusion. Mr. Black, thank you, John Black, for being on our program. And ladies and gentlemen, we've found this very informative, and we believe you have also. And the news that I hope you will like to hear is that he'll be back with us next week in Part 2. And we're going to continue our discussion of the FAA and its rules and our expertise of our guests to talk about other things in planes and safety. And we simply got it introduced today to you. And I hope you will join us for Part 2 of this program next week. I would also encourage you to write to us or call us from time to time with your suggestions of what you'd like to hear on our program. Again, we'll be back with you next week with John Black dealing with planes and safety. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho, local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome back to our second program with our guest, Mr. John R. Black. He is a safety program manager with the Flight Standards District Office in Spokane, Washington for the Federal Aviation Administration. For our viewers who were not with us last week, we had a very informative discussion about the whole question of FAA rules and aircraft and safety, and we also discussed some of the tragedies that we have seen in recent months that also is of interest of how we might explain what might have happened. And of course, there are other agencies that are investigating those particular tragedies. John R. Black is highly informed to be our guest, and he is a pilot and with many hundreds of hours of flying experience. And he also has investigated accidents as well as other duties he has with the FAA. John Black, welcome back to the program. It was really informative last week, and we look forward to this week's interview.
Well, thank you for having me again. Appreciate it.
And as always, I'm pleased to have a regular two panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Well, in recent times, we're taping this show in November, and in recent times we've had an accident that involved a small private pilot, a small private aircraft and pilot, John F. Kennedy, and then we've had a medium-sized, a corporate aircraft, if you will, the Learjet carrying Payne Stewart and his associates, and then we've also had a large commercial craft that has crashed off the eastern coast. So can you tell us what some of the differences are between the safety records for these various kinds of airplanes?
Well, the small craft, such as John Kennedy, probably has the worst safety record if you're to compare them all. They are usually flown by private pilots who are not professional pilots, and they're flying airplanes that simply are not built to the same standards as a commercial airliner. You go on up the corporate ladder. The corporate planes actually have a very good safety record. In fact, they're slightly better than the airlines. But most of the time you have jet aircraft. They are flown by professional pilots who go through rigorous training and recurrent training. And of course the airlines, which also are meet the very highest standard of safety. The FAA is pretty much governed by what they call the FAA Act. It is a public law. And by the public law, it says that air carriers, meaning the large aircraft, will have the highest standard of safety.
Now, last week we talked about some of the certificates that are necessary for the private pilot, but we didn't talk about what's necessary for the commercial pilot. And there are very specific certificates that are required for them, as well as rating on the various types of aircraft. Can you explain that to our viewers?
Yes. To be a captain on an airliner or on a corporate plane, any turbojet, or in an air carrier such as an airliner, the pilot has to have an airline transport certificate. And in addition, that pilot has to have a type rating, meaning that that pilot has had specific training on the systems of that specific airplane, such as a Boeing 737, a Boeing 767, a MD-11, or a Learjet 35. They all require a specific type rating. So that pilot has had specialized training on that make and model. In addition to that, they have to have recurrent training in that same make and model.
Mr. Black, we didn't talk a lot in our previous show about mechanical aspects of safety. You did mention, and some of our viewers who are watching last week will recall it, that oftentimes accidents aren't due to one event but a series of events. Maybe it starts with a mechanical malfunction and things get worse from there. What different kinds of standards are imposed on private aircraft and commercial aircraft as far as upkeep and maintenance of the equipment is concerned?
Okay. They all have to, when an airplane is certificated, it has to meet what they call a type certificate for the type of airplane. In a small one, you might have like a Cessna 172. On a large one, you'll have a Boeing 747. These airplanes have to be maintained to that type certificate all the time. And there are manuals and manuals, especially on the larger ones, that say specifically what maintenance has to be performed on these. And pretty much they have to be in about the same shape as when they rolled off the factory floor.
So it's very rigorous and an expensive proposition to maintain an aircraft to commercial standards.
Oh, absolutely.
Janelle mentioned 3 highly publicized air accidents in recent months. Or just before we started taping, we talked a little bit about the effects of high altitude on pilots and passengers. I assume it wouldn't have applied in the Kennedy crash. I assume he was flying at fairly low levels prior to the accident, but certainly was a factor in the Payne Stewart disaster and may have been in the Air Egypt crash as well if the plane did break up at high altitude. What happens to pilots and passengers when they're suddenly exposed to the pressures of 30+ thousand feet altitude?
It's actually the opposite of the pressures. The pressure is taken off of
The
you.
lack of pressure.
Yes,
yeah.
the lack of pressure. What happens, and the best way I can describe it is it's like getting the wind knocked out of you. And that's exactly what happens. We have an ambient pressure in our lungs, which is equal to the outside pressure. When we take away the pressure from the outside, the air from our lungs, everything, it comes out of us immediately. And then the oxygen tension, the oxygen comes out of our hemoglobin. And so we don't have the oxygen going to our brain anymore. Another factor that can happen is similar to scuba divers. We can actually get the bands. The nitrogen can come out of solution into our bloodstream too and can go up into our brains.
So it's a term I've heard used a couple of times, especially with the Payne Stewart crash, this, period of useful consciousness. In the case of a rapid depressurization at 39,000 feet, which was the altitude where the private jet Payne Stewart was in, may have lost cabin pressure, can be what? How long might you stay conscious and
Maybe
functioning?
10 seconds at the very most. And that is if you're lucky. But it can hurt so badly that 10 seconds you're going to be in a daze and not be able to really do anything about it. Pilots train for this. Military pilots go into a pressure chamber where they actually experience it. I know I have experienced it, and it's an eye opener. Most commercial pilots don't, but they train every time they go to their simulator. They do train on donning the masks and things, but it's still not quite the same as actually having it happen.
Thank you.
When these terrible tragedies take place, of course, all the agencies that are responsible work immediately trying to diagnose what happened. The families obviously really need to know, and also for future safety and maybe even some changes in the construction in the future. I know in some interviews that I heard during the Air Egypt tragedy that some private consultants that were being interviewed by the journalists indicated different viewpoints. And one of the ones that I'd like to bring up, and these are all theories, not verified, but one gentleman was indicating that in the construction of the wiring of planes, that's a place to look, that there could be oftentimes the most risk. There's miles and miles of wiring in large commercial planes, and that he discussed something, and I'm not sure I have the terminology correct, but the cap covers that are over some of the wiring at certain centers that are plastic, and that those could heat. Could you share with us some of your expertise on what we need to do or what we need to be concerned about concerning wiring? And again, I want to footnote it by what you said on the previous program, that commercial flying is getting safer and safer, but we are trying to analyze these situations where these tragedies take place.
Well, I think I'm in operations and not in maintenance,
Sure.
But these airplanes are getting older, a lot of them, and as things, as components age, they get brittle, they crack, and the FAA has a program now on aging aircraft, and how do we combat this? What needs to be changed? From a personal note, I know what they call cannon plugs, which are little connectors that take wires and put them together. It seems like on older aircraft you have trouble with these cannon plugs, and all of a sudden you'll see one of your components will fail. And it's been my experience 9 times out of 10 it's one of those cannon plugs. Well, what they're doing now is they're rewriting standards that, maybe we used to have them replace, and I'm going to just use an example. Maybe these plugs had to be replaced at, let's say, 5,000 or 10,000 hours. Now maybe they'll do them at 2,500 hours. So the engineers are always learning. Unfortunately, until something happens, you don't always know that something is really wrong or there's really a design problem.
That's a real good example, isn't it, Mr. Black, of when you do find the problem of a particular crash, and you know that, then engineers can work on that. The other issue that we hear so much about, and I'll return to the panel, and the accident that took place some time ago that was, I believe it was a Swedish airline off the New York coast that, again, killed so many people. They were very suspicious, and they haven't solved that one yet, but at the time of the taping of this program, that they were talking about the fuel tanks, and on some of those planes when you have the center tank. And what I also heard in discussion recently in their theorizing is that when a plane sits on the runway for quite a while waiting to take off at the more busy airports, that tank can heat up. And they also talked about if the tank is empty, that there's certain fumes that could possibly be explosive. Again, from your investigation of accidents and all, is this an area that needs focus about tanks and the possibility of explosion?
Well, I do know they are looking into that. The FAA, I believe, on 737s had a lot of the electrical connections on a lot of the 737s were subject to what they call an emergency AD. It's an airworthiness directive, which means, hey, we have a problem, let's fix it. And they'll actually ground part of the fleet. As far as the heat in the tank, I believe that was a Boeing report and my information is from the news media, that was simply a Boeing report, I believe in the 1980s, on the military version of the 747, that they had experienced some fuel tank heating. Whether or not that had any effect on any of these crashes is just pure speculation right now, and I really can't answer that.
One other final question that's on that line. Does the FAA or any other Civil Aeronautics Board or the Transportation Board that investigates safety, is it meaningful for people who are planning on flying in the future to have more knowledge about planes or how new they are or the type of plane? I know that when you go to schedule a flight, you take the plane that's available, but is there more information going to be available?
Well, I'm not sure, to the amateur pilot or the passenger really knowing what the different makes and models of airplanes is going to make a whole lot of difference. They are all built to the same standard. They're built to the same. They're all type certificated by the FAA. The standards are there, and I really can't see where there's much difference on one make or model.
Thank you, Janelle Berg.
Let's talk a little bit about pre-flight planning and what happens. Let's take a commercial liner, for example. What happens in that pre-flight time?
Okay, during the pre-flight, the pilots usually show up, minimum, and it depends on the company, but a half hour to an hour prior to the flight. They check the weather. They check their loading. They check their airplanes. They're checking the length of their flights, and they are also, of course, and the dispatchers have also done some of the work to make sure the pilots are properly rested. The FAA has very stringent standards on how long a pilot can fly in a day. And so what they're doing is they're getting the weather reports and they're just planning their flight out. And the route of flight, they're calling to see if there's been any air traffic delays along the ways, any turbulence reports. Maybe they can change their route of flight a little to give the passengers a better ride.
So they do all of that before they're ready to go. And then
yes.
The FAA, the air traffic controllers, I want to ask a question about those folks that are in the tower, because it seems to me like there are so many airplanes at major airports. We're not talking now about our local area, but in some of the really large metropolitan areas, you look out and you see planes everywhere. How do they keep track of all of them?
Well, I don't think it's magic, but what they do is they have they're mostly under radar. And if you go into one of the control rooms, you'll see a whole line of radar controllers. And each one of those has a little sector that they are controlling. And they talk among themselves, one sector here, one sector here, and one sector here. And it's kind of an art, and the computer actually helps sequence them too. And so they actually can wash the planes in, and I think it's through experience and training they're able to do it.
Now, does the air traffic controller tell them what altitude they're going to fly at?
Yes, when they are under instrument flight rules, yes. They are course and altitude, and in a lot of cases, speed.
And why do they fly so high?
They fly so high because jet airplanes fly much more efficiently up high. They burn a lot less fuel, they get better speed, and they're over the weather, too.
Less turbulence, in other
Less
words.
turbulence, and the passengers like it that way.
Mr. Black, before the show we were talking about the changes that even in our lifetimes we've seen. Of course, commercial aviation is not that much older than we are. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the truth. From a time when a flight was a big thing, you got dressed up for it, to the point today where so many people fly all the time. Corollary to that, although it's still not as common as domestic flight, though, is international flight. Airlines are partnering. You must have interactions with foreign airlines, and of course, U.S. airlines deal with foreign equivalents, I assume, of the FAA when they fly out of the airspace of the United States. I don't want to set you up to criticize your counterparts, but how much do the standards vary from country to country?
There's an organization called ICAO, International Civil Aeronautic Association. And ICAO has set standards, and to become what they call an ICAO member, they have to meet these standards. The FAA has actually adopted some of ICAO's standards, especially in the airspace realm. And so their standards on an ICAO member are virtually the same as the United States.
How universal is ICAO membership?
Most countries belong to NATO, or not NATO, excuse me, ICAO.
And I believe, and I may not be able to give you enough information for you to comment, but I'm pretty certain that I saw in a paper not long ago something that they either called zones or codes, which was cooperative agreements between airlines, and that I thought Delta had stopped working codes, maybe I'm using the wrong term, with maybe airlines in China and one other location because they were uncomfortable with the standards those countries brought to that association. Does that ring a bell with you at all?
I'm not familiar with that, no.
Well, let me move on to another somewhat related topic then. I'm sure one of the difficulties in your business is balancing that overriding desire for safety, and I know that is your highest priority, with the costs involved. And at some point, I assume you have to, as you set standards in the FAA, you have to draw a line and say, yes, this might be safer, but the cost just isn't justified. How do you go about that?
Well, this is true. Safety does have a cost. And the way that the FAA sets standards to manage the risk factors. And what you try to do is manage the most effectively those risk factors at a cost-efficient basis. I suppose you could design an airplane and have escape capsules for every person on board, guaranteeing even a higher level of safety or crashworthiness in this case. But if your ticket from Spokane to Boise was $3,000 or $4,000, there wouldn't be many people riding. We accept some risk when we do anything in life. The FAA is trying to manage that risk, and I think they do an excellent job of it. The record really stands for itself.
And one last question, if I may, Tony. I'm sure you do a lot of statistical and computer modeling in determining safety and cost ratios and that sort of thing. Clearly, the FAA spends an enormous amount of time and resource in investigating crashes. Is that one of your most valuable sources of information about what makes planes safe and what leads to those very occasional problems?
The FAA itself is not responsible for crashes, for the investigation. That's actually the National Transportation Safety Board. And what it gives an independent agency because FAA is the regulator.
They would be investigating themselves.
They'd be investigating themselves.
So
the NTSB does. But the NTSB does issue safety recommendations as a result of their investigation. And the FAA does incorporate that into pilot certification standards, into aircraft certification standards, into just every realm of safety pretty much. The problem and I think maybe what you're getting at is it's like cleaning wastewater is probably a good analogy. You can take out 99% of the waste at a pretty a reasonable cost. Getting that extra 1% becomes very costly. And getting up towards zero accidents starts costing a lot of money.
Thank you.
We've heard a lot recently about in driving automobiles and so forth on our busy interstates and highways, something called road rage. I know recently, well, some months ago, Congressman Duncan from the state of Tennessee chaired or does chair a committee in which they had an investigation and had flight attendants in particular testifying before his committee that it's a small percentage, but they are passengers who have some form of, I guess, air rage that's similar to on highways, and some flight attendants have been injured. Could you speak to that issue? And again, I guess the National Transportation Safety Board would be involved, of course, on the investigation. That could increase the possibility of an accident with some misbehavior by passengers. And I'd just like you, if you would, just address that issue, that to make people aware that on the flights I've been on, passengers are very cooperative, but there are incidents where even flight attendants are hit, or someone, for example, had too much alcohol and they get up and will not sit down. And even planes sometimes are brought into an airport to deal with the problem. Before the flight is ended, they'll stop the flight early by stopping another airport.
The flight attendants are safety people on that airplane, and you have to remember that. Giving you your Coke or your glass or your cup of coffee is secondary. Their main purpose is for the safety, and depending on how many people are on that airplane determines how many flight attendants. It's not on how fast they can serve your coffee. It is a safety thing. When a person interferes with the duties of that safety person, it is a violation of the Federal Aviation regulations. Normally, this is handled through the Security Division of the FAA.
So the FAA is involved in that?
Yes. When you get an unruly passenger, I know one time in Boise we had one that there were two drunk individuals on Southwest was taxiing out, and one of them hit one of the flight attendants. The flight attendants radioed the captain stopped the airplane, taxied back into the gate, they took the two individuals out and arrested them.
And that's a crime, and they'll be prosecuted.
And that is a crime. Because they are, interfering with my right to having a safe flight.
So
they do that.
The pilot and the flight attendants together, they have a jurisdiction over that plane and can make those decisions instantly. They
can say this person is interfering with my duties as a safety, as a crew member on this airplane, and they report it to the FAA. The FAA will investigate it. People still have the right to a fair trial. It's not automatically whether you're guilty, but it is investigated, and they are brought up usually on charges.
Janelle Berg.
We've talked a lot about various aspects of flying, but we haven't talked much about the safety of flying, that it's a very safe way to move about the country. Can you give us some idea, generally speaking, of the statistical possibilities of accident?
Probably the way I've had it explained is that of being killed on a commercial airline flight, you have a much higher chance of being struck by lightning. That if you drive to the airport, this is the most dangerous part of your entire trip. The airline flight is actually the safest part. It is very safe to fly, and it is getting safer.
Prior to our program, you gave us an article that was a very good article that we read, and it had 4 points of things that, with private pilots, they should be thinking about before they embark on their journey. Can you just briefly, very briefly, take us through those 4 points?
Okay, well, the pilot themselves, they need to determine their own capabilities. The flight, they need to do the pre-flight like we talked about, make sure that is within their capability, and the equipment capability of making that flight. The aircraft, make sure the aircraft is pre-flighted, that it's in a sound mechanical condition. It has enough fuel in it. It's amazing how many people run out of gas. The environment, weather, making sure the weather is good. Making sure altitude, that their airplane has enough performance, like going over the mountains takes more performance than flying over the flatlands. And lastly, our external pressures. Have you had a bad day? Are you rested? A person needs to ask themselves these questions prior to jumping into the airplane.
Very short time remaining, but I'm just curious, airway crowding. Flight is becoming much more popular. is a danger factor. Who controls that? Does the FAA limit the number of flights between destinations that are allowed in the course of a certain period of time?
Yes, there are standards, and both altitude and lateral standards, and you can only put so many airplanes through a specific road. And airway is kind of like a road in the sky. Now, fortunately, with some of the newer navigation equipment, we can go direct a lot more. So it's actually opening up more off the airspace.
Thank you.
We're just running out of time, but Ms. Black, also we're building some more airports, and so that's distributing, I assume, the traffic too. Or some of them expand, like in Denver, they build a major new airport, so that could be helpful. On behalf of our panel and our staff, John R. Black, it's been a pleasure having you in our program. We thank you for the 2 weeks you spent with you. You've given us a lot of time and a lot of information, and I know it's been very constructive and helpful to our viewers, and that's why we do the program. And I want to publicly thank you for being so generous with your time, and good luck in your work.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I certainly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we end a 2-week series that we have been doing on dealing with rules of aircraft and safety and what's happening in flying. And we certainly have appreciated the opportunity to bring it to you, and we hope it's informative. And we'd like to end by indicating that we believe that, as our guest does, that flying is safe, and we simply want to bring more information to you so it can be helpful and even more improvement in the future. I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.